Hey guys, it's Israel. Today we're going to be diving into Angular version 14. I will be having a full tutorial right after I go over kind of the new features, and it will be an Angular 14 application with a .NET 6 web API with Entity Framework, a SQL database, all the CRUD operations for it, and we're going to be showing just a full-blown application in Angular 14 and .NET 6. But now let's check out kind of the new features in Angular 14. Usually these updates aren't massive, and it's just maybe one or two cool features with a lot of kind of just like quality of life improvement, and that's kind of what we have here. So let's dive into the two cool features, I guess. So the first of the two kind of new features that they're adding, I think is going to also set a precedent of kind of where Angular wants to go, which is kind of what they've been doing in the last few updates and recent versions. Is just they're trying to make their applications as fast and small as possible. And that's kind of where they're going with standalone components. So basically what you do on standalone components is you are basically getting rid of the ng modules. You're going to be moving that into your component files, leaving one file less for every single one of these components. What does that mean? It just means that you have less files, you have less code, you have less things to have to, compact whenever you're trying to run your application. So it just makes your files and your projects just smaller. And right now, these are going to be in developer preview. I will not be using them in my tutorial because they could possibly change. They are not stable. The syntax, kind of the best practices, could change going forward. So I don't want to make something and then things kind of change right after I make the video or something. So I just want you guys to know they are out there and you guys can use them right now and dabble in them. They seem kind of cool. I'm excited to see, I guess, where they go with them. But for now, I think that's kind of all we have with that. And now the second, I think, really cool feature are typed Angular forms. So basically, what are these? This is basically just whenever you create your form, as you can see kind of from this example that's kind of going through, you have your form, and if you have these like nested values, or even if you just have multiple values in your form, you're able to access them all the way, and in real time, it's going to tell you, is that value actually there, or are you going to have an error? And in the past, with these forms, you wouldn't really get these errors until you actually ran your application. And then it'd be like, oh, this value in this form doesn't exist, or it's misspelled. Here, it's actually going to tell you, like, address has a house that has, like, a name or whatever, down the line. You'll actually be able to access that. And I'm going to actually show you guys kind of how that works in my tutorial, in my application, because I think it's actually kind of nice. It's just nice to, while you're just coding, to already know that everything's good there, and that you're not going to have an error when you actually run your application. And other than these two changes, everything else is kind of quality of life stuff, just small improvements here and there. I will link this blog, which is like their official blog, in the description if you guys want to go check it out. But right now, let's go dive into the project. And before we dive into the project, just wanted to say, if you guys end up finding this video useful, please drop a like and subscribe so you guys don't miss any of my future content. But with that being said, let's now dive into the project. First things first, we are going to create the web API project, and then we are going to add into that the standalone Angular project. So let's go do that first. And our project is going to be a soccer player API. So on the front end, I'm going to just show a list of famous soccer players. I'm going to be being able to add soccer players to the list, delete soccer players from the list, edit soccer players on the list, and then obviously get all the soccer players. So our API is going to be doing all those 4 CRUD operations, and is going to be the thing interacting with the front end, obviously, and our SQL database using Entity Framework. So that's what the API is going to do. That's why it's going to be called Soccer Player API. And .NET 6. And now let us create this project. And boom, here we have it. We have very basic API, and I'm going to be doing this second. I'm going to be doing the front end first, and then we're going to come back and we're going to actually do the API second. Let me just get rid of kind of these defaults. I'm going to get rid of these defaults, and I'm actually just going to set up my folder structure for the repository pattern. Okay, now that I created my folders, this is all I'm going to do for now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the solution in VS Code, and I'm going to actually make the Angular project, and then we're going to do all the front end, and then we will eventually come back and circle around to this API and then actually get the back end working, and then we'll put everything together as well. So now let's go do the Angular app. Okay, now that I have the soccer player API open in Visual Studio Code, we're not going to create the Angular project. Personally, I like to do Angular in VS Code, and C#, my APIs, all that stuff I like to do in Visual Studio. That's just my way of doing it. I think it's just easier to do, Visual Studio Code with Angular, but it's my preference. You don't have to do it that way. But now let's open Soccer Player API in here. Let me first just check my Angular version. So that's going to be NGV. I already have 14 installed, but I will still run all the commands needed so that you guys can see all the commands if you guys obviously aren't upgraded to the newest one. So first things first, ng new, and I'm going to do client app because it's going to be the front end application of it. Yes, we want Angular routing. I'm just going to do CSS. I personally like SCSS, but for now, I'm not going to do a lot of styling, so let's just do CSS. And let's create the application, and I'll be right back once it's done. Okay, so the project has now successfully been created. You see the client app right here with all just the default project down here. So the next thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to open your client app in your terminal because your Soccer Player API does not have Angular in it. Your Angular project is client app, so you want to jump into that. So now the next thing you want to do, this is where it gets a little bit tricky and where you have to do commands in certain orders and you can run into a lot of issues, but I'm going to try and do it the quickest way to get Angular installed, Node installed, try and get Angular material in there as well, and just have everything that you're going to need to just set up your Angular version 14 application. So the first command, let's go with npm install. Actually, first command is going to be do an ng build. So first command is going to be just an ng build. We're just going to kind of get just the dist folder created, the node modules, everything kind of going in the application. This is brand new. You just kind of want to generate everything that you're going to need. Now let's do an npm install. So now you might have changes here, and when you try and install Angular, it's going to tell you that you need to clean your repo up or commit or stash or just get rid of your changes. So I'm going to try and do it here. It might tell me, yeah, my repository is not clean. So hopefully you guys have a little bit of understanding of Git. I will do a video in the future about Git and all that stuff. But for now, all you want to do is you probably just want to just check in these changes, stage all, and just commit it. If this is your first commit, you're just going to want to do an initial commit and just push it. So now you should have no issue being able to update your Angular core and your Angular CLI to 14. As you guys can see, I'm already up to date, but if you run this command, it should update. It'll take a little bit, but then you should be ready to go. And then next time you do ngv, you should see 14 here. That's what you want to see, obviously. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to do an npm install of Node, because as of now, I believe, let me correctly check, you need version 14.15 or later. So right now it's installing 17.7, but just be aware that you do need something after 14.15. So now that I have that, now the next thing here is where it gets a little tricky. So I'm gonna try and add Angular material because I want to use that for the UI. I don't want to have to create a bunch from scratch. So hopefully this has no issue. I'm gonna try and install Angular material 14.01. Yes. Okay, so thankfully I was able to install Angular material correctly. It went and there was no issues. Now that I actually have everything that I need to set up the project correctly installed, let's actually start creating our components, everything that we're going to need for the front end. First things first, like I mentioned, we're going to be using Angular material. So when you use Angular material, it's best to just make a module for all your Angular material stuff to just import them there. So I'm going to go ahead and create that right now. So new folder, material, and then I'm just going to create a new file, material.module.ts. And then all you really want to do here, I'm just going to quickly import this file. So basically you just want to do all your imports from Angular up at the top, and then you just export them, and then they'll be used all over kind of the application here. You will have to add this package into your app.module. So you will need to do that. Let's go ahead and do that just to not get too out of sync. Let's throw that in here, and we're going to need our import statement. So let's go ahead and throw that in there. Cool. So our Angular material is now set up in here. Now the next thing I'm going to create is the one model that I'm actually going to need for this project. So we're going to have our models folder. So this is going to be my soccer player model. It's going to be a very tiny model. The soccer players are just going to have a player ID, which is going to be, its ID in the database. It's a name and a jersey number. And then this is just going to be the constructor. Very simple, straightforward. Nothing too crazy with this model. Very simple. Now the next part that we have to create is we have to create the UI where we're going to show the list of soccer players. And then we also have to create the form that we're going to use to add and edit our soccer players. So we're going to go in. I'm going to open app in terminal. And then the first thing we're going to do is we are going to run the command ng, G for generate, C component. And then we're going to call it player list. And then you need to call a module that you're going to be throwing it into, and it's going to be app. And then if you just want to test kind of the path that everything's correct, I always like to do -- dry run. Just this will show me the path of where these are going to be created. So it's going to be in the app, and it's going to create a player list folder, and then inside of there. That's exactly what I want. So now I can just go back, run that same command, and now it's actually going to create that player list. So now that we have our player list here, I want to just go into that player list directory. And now that we're in that, I now want to create my player form because I want to have that nested inside. And it's going to be very similar, except it's just player form. Again, I'm going to do a dry run to make sure that it's inside my player list folder. As you can see, player list, player form folder inside player list. And then now we have our player form component. So now let's go do that. Let's create it. So now that we actually have our player list and our player form, I actually want to set our player list to be kind of the default path whenever our application opens. So what I want to do is I want to add kind of that default path here. I think I need to import Angular router. Yes, so now our default path whenever you just open up the application is going to open with player list component. I need to get rid of this big template though that comes whenever you create an application in Angular, because we don't need any of this. We just want our code. So let's get rid of that default stuff now that we have that out of the way. Cool. So now let's actually do what our player list is going to look like. Our player list is going to just have a header, quick little header here, soccer player table. And then our next thing, it's going to have a button. This button will be a matte raised button, color primary, and it's going to be an add player button. Very simple, very straightforward. It is just a button, and that's the one that we're going to click to create new players. And then we are going to have a table, and I will explain the table right as we go. So the table, it's again going to be a Angular material table. It's going to have a data source that is data sources. It's going to have a name column, a jersey number column, and then those are the two columns that we're going to be displaying. And then at the end of the column is going to have an edit player button and a delete player button. We're using matte Angular material icon. So all those are things that we have imported here. So table, icon, and then we are going to be using snack bar and a few other little things, just especially dialogue for like the pop-up for doing editing and editing. That's what our kind of pop-up for our player form is going to be. Speaking of that, let's go and add it in. I will go back and add all the .ts stuff in a little bit. I'm just kind of setting up all my HTML. So now player form, what is our player form going to be? Quickly, again, it's just going to be a simple header saying please enter the player info. And then we're just going to have the dialog content right here, which is going to be a form, a new player form, which is just two form fields that are player name, jersey number. And then we're just going to have a button that this one's just going to close the dialog pop-up. And then this one's going to be the submit button. So now that we have our HTML, let's go ahead and do actually, the TypeScript. So for our player form, this one's going to be kind of a lot tinier because we don't have as much, but this is where the form kind of comes into play. So first of all, I need to create some variables, just an add player, and then let me just throw in my constructor. It's a lot of typing, so why waste so much time? Let me import everything that I'm going to need here. Import core, import matte dialog. Let's import our snack bar. Material snack bar. And then we do not have our services created. That will be in a second. I will make sure to not forget that. So our constructor here, basically our dialog will be passing in data, and we're about to do that in the other file. So don't worry about it. We'll get to it. We're going to have a form. This is going to be our form. Very simple, very straightforward, nothing too wild. We've added our form here. I imported all the things that we needed to, but also just for good measure, make sure to pull in this reactive form module. It doesn't always need to. Sometimes it'll throw errors. I just kind of like to add it just for, just for being safe sometimes, because sometimes just stuff happens and I'd rather just have everything that I think I'm going to need in there. The next thing I kind of want to do is I kind of want to get rid of this squiggly line right here. So let me go ahead and create my service, because that's what this form will need going forward. I am going to close this stuff so I don't get confused. And we're going to have this services. And then inside of here, I'm going to open another terminal, and I'm just going to do ng s for service. And we are just going to call this, I believe, services. Cool, it created my services. So now we have our services. Services is what it's called. And I am just gonna quickly set this up. It is a very quick setup for this. So what we're gonna do, also, we're gonna need to set up our environment API URL. We're gonna have to set that up. We're gonna need to import our HTTP client, because this is what we're gonna be using to interact with our API. And then we're gonna have 4 calls here that I'm just gonna copy in. They're very small, but I will walk you through all of them. But these are our CRUD operations that our front end will use to interact with our back end. And let me bring in everything that I'm going to need here. Let's pull in our model, and we will address this in just a second. But basically, so this is our service. This is like the HTTP service that will go from the front end to the back end. And so this is going to be just our get all players. It is just going to get a list of players. This is the endpoint. Edit player is going to take a player, and it's going to put it JSON stringify it and pass it to the backend. Create a new player is going to do the exact same thing, except it's going to be a post. And then delete is basically just going to pass in an ID in the URL, and we're going to delete a player. And then we're just going to receive these and catch them back in the front end whenever the API replies to us. But you see that squiggly line on environment.api URL? Well, let's fix that. I'm going to import just this. I'm not going to be doing the prod one because we don't really need that right now. But for right now, we will need to set up an API URL, because that's what this is going to want to put. And when you're actually in production here, you'd want to be able to set the production flag so that it'll choose the proper environment. Depending on, I guess, what environment you want, it picks the correct API URL. Okay, so I quickly just went back to the API that we created at the beginning of the project, and now it is going to be localhost 7175. We will set it up with cores and all that other stuff. We'll get into that in a second. Once we actually get to the API, but we should be done with this. We should have no more errors on our services. Cool. Now we should be able to go back here. We should be able to import this now and get rid of this error. Awesome. Okay, so now that we've imported our services and we have no more errors here, I want to jump now to that main player list that we have not yet done. So I want to actually do the TypeScript for this, so that then we can go from kind of the TypeScript from the main page to then the forms to the services, and now complete the connection, because we've done over here and we haven't done anything over here, and we've done a little bit in the middle. Now I kind of want to start putting it all together. So let's go do the TypeScript for the player list, and let's get all that done so we can actually start making something that makes sense. Okay, so now that we're at our player list component, we need to first of all set the data source for our table. Let's import mat table data source. So this is what's gonna actually be what binds, not here, but here. This is what's actually gonna be bound here to our table, and you will see that. Next thing we're gonna add here is gonna be the displayed columns. So you actually, when you use a Angular material table, you do need to pass in a list array of what columns you want to show. If not, it will not show the appropriate columns. And then our constructor is going to be the mat dialog, which we're going to import here, mat snack bar, because we're going to show just a little message whenever like a task finishes executing. And then again, we're going to need our services, because this one's also going to be deleting and adding directly without going to the pop-up. And our mat dialog is what we're going to actually be using to show the pop-up that then shows that player form that we created. So on ng-init, the only thing I want to do is I just want to call this.getPlayers. What is this.getPlayers? We're about to define that right now. So getPlayers is just going to be a small async method. That is what it is. This gets the players from the DB. So we already have our services that we defined up here. So our this.services get all players will go from here. It will go to our services and go here and just call this endpoint. So once you load this page, it'll immediately go and load the grid. And then it basically says we're going to get a soccer player list back. And then we're going to bind it to our data source. So that's what's going to happen on init. So now let's go ahead and define add player. When it comes to add player, this one's going to be a little bit more complex, but it's still not going to be anything crazy. Let's import our mat dialog and then our player form component. So what's going on here? Let's explain. So mat dialog is going to be the pop-up that you guys will see in a little bit. I'm basically just defining its properties. So it's going to be disable close, autofocus, with, and then I'm basically saying that the dialog and these configurations are going to be for the player form component, which we already created over here. This little pop-up right here. That's what is going to be happening in there. And then after we close, which means whatever happens, whatever processes, when you click that add and that pop-up opens, we are just going to say the thing is closed. And clearly, if there was no error and we get the correct result back, we're just going to say a little pop-up, a little snack bar that says player was created successfully. And then we run this.getPlayers. I'm not sure if this is going to run because it's not like async and it's not like reloading. So I'm not sure if that's going to work. But regardless, if we were going to like reload the page and then our data is going to kind of refresh. And now the other thing that we're going to have to do, we're going to do edit player and delete player. So edit player, I'm just going to kind of throw in here quickly because it's going to be very similar to add player, except the difference is the add player button is going to be kind of at the end of each row so that we can get the full player, the player to edit, as I say right here. And the difference here is in the mat dialog configuration, we're actually going to pass in the .data, the player. And then we're going to do everything else the same. And if you guys remember, whenever you go to the player form, you see this inject mat dialog data. This is where we're actually getting that data that I'm passing in the edit. And we're about to do something with it right now in a little bit. But let's get the delete done. And now finally, the last method is going to be the delete player. Another async delete player. We're basically, just like the edit, going to be at the end of the row so that we can quickly get the player. Again, player to delete. It's just going to be, this one's going to be direct to the service. There's not a mat dialog. You could do a pop-up. You could do something that says, are you sure you want to delete? But for these purposes, I just kind of want to show the delete. So we're just going to go ahead and do it. So it's, again, once it deletes, it's going to show a little, a little snack bar. But we're just going straight to the service, delete player, straight to here, and just passing along that player ID. But now that we have all this set up in our player list and we have, all these methods, now let's do our player form and let's fix that so that we don't have these errors because we have two methods here and we have to do, the add and the edit in that form. So first things first, on our ng init, we're going to need to know, is there data passed in? Because if there's data passed in, that means this is going to be an edit. Usually this is kind of how you reuse components in Angular. If you have an add or an edit, at least I always try and use kind of the same visual component. The only difference is really you pass in kind of values or you don't pass anything in. And that's kind of how you know, oh, is this an add or is this just an edit? So in our ng init, we're just going to have this little check here. Basically, is there any data passed in? And if it's not null, that means that we're getting something and it's an edit. So I'm going to set this flag and then I'm going to set the form to have this data. And now if you guys remember from the new Angular 14 features is we have now typed forms. So I'm able to just directly get into these values and get, kind of deep in there. So let's say I have this other example. Let me comment this out and let me throw in this new form. So this new form has name, jersey number, team, club, and city. So let's say in this new form, kind of ignore the error. I just kind of want to give this example. So let's say I wanted to go in and check kind of team, club. And so I wanted to kind of get deeper into that. And I wanted to go, so this dot new player form, and then I could go dot value. And then I could just go straight into team. And then team is also going to have a city. So before, this could give an error because let's say I was like, oh, I don't know what this is. And I just said cities. This would not give me an error right here. I would not get this. I wouldn't get it until I run or compile the application. So this is just a little type thing. It's just Angular just being more strict and just kind of conforming to what it's kind of been doing. But now let's go back to the form that we were actually using. And that's all we're going to have on ng init. Just basically, this is the setup if it's an edit. And then quickly, we just have this kind of this is just going to be on no click. Basically, right here, you're just going to close it. So all we want to do here is we just want to close the dialog. And then the last method that we're going to have for this is going to be our on submit. And what goes on here is basically, was that flag triggered whenever we open the dialog? If so, we're going to grab our information from the form. And then basically what goes on in this on submit, which is our final method, is going to be, was that is edit flag set? If it wasn't set, then we are creating a new player. So we're just going to grab our values from the form, pass in a 0 for an ID because, it's new. And then we're just going to pass it along to the create a new player service and then pass it along through here. Otherwise, it was an edit. That means that we do have a player ID that we're going to need to pass in because we have to edit a certain entry. And then we're just going to go to the services edit player. And then both of them are just going to close once it finishes. And then again, we're just going to go to this edit player. And after all of that, we finally have this whole project set up with Angular and all that stuff. So now what do I want to do? First of all, I want to do an npm install in case I missed anything. There's been a lot of stuff that I've added to this project. I haven't ran it, so I want to do an npm install. I want to make sure everything is good. Now let's do an ng serve so you guys can actually see kind of what we've built and the code and visually see the representation of what I mean. So our application is now running. Let's check it out. And I'm getting a white page. Let me check. App service, HTTP client. Okay, so I guess I missed something in the client. Let me check. Believe I missed this import. I think this should be it. This should probably fix it. Okay, let's go back and check. And as you can see, we now have our front end here. This is going to be our pop-up where we add this. This is what we're closing. So this is all we're going to have basically right now. So we have a soccer player table. We have our table here, name, jersey number, and then our actions are going to be that edit and delete buttons, which are not here because we don't have any entries. But we're going to have a player name, jersey number that we're just going to add, close, and create. And I'm not going to do anything because we do not have a web API right now. So now let's go and do the whole web API and set all of that up, including creating our database. Okay guys, so we are now officially back at our API. So now let's build out our whole backend. But first, what I want to do, since I am a fan of database first, we're going to just go ahead and create our database. We have just one model, which is going to be just our players table. And then we're just going to have a database. So let's go ahead, let's finish that. And then we'll come back, do the controllers, do the repository pattern, and do all of that. So let's quickly go and just create our new database. So we're going to do new database here. I'm going to call it sample database, nothing super creative. Sample database, let's create it. Let's quickly go in here. New table. Our new table is going to have player ID. It's going to be an int. Set the primary key. We're going to go in here. We want to be able to set the ID because we do want this to increase correctly and not just stay at 0. We want it to go 1, 2, 3 as we create new ones or edit. Now we're going to want a name here. So this can just be kind of a varchar. Doesn't really matter. And then we want a jersey number. So that can also just be an int. We save this. And it's going to be our player table. Boom. We should have our tables correct. Boom. Nothing in there. I'm actually going to go in there and just make one. Make our first entry here. It's going to be Neymar. It's going to be a 10 because that's his jersey number. Boom. We have one entry now. So we have something in our database. Now let's go scaffold this in. Okay, guys. So in preparation to actually scaffold our DB context and any models, especially, that players table that we created. So with that, you will need to install Entity Framework, Entity Framework Core, Entity Framework Core Design, and Entity Framework Core SQL Server. And once you install them, make sure you build your solution. If you do not build your solution and then you try and run this command, .NET EF DB scaffold, and then your connection string, and then you have SQL Server, your output is your models folder, and then you force it in case you already have things created. If you do not build before this, this will fail because it won't find any of the Entity Framework Core stuff because you need to actually build it and get all that stuff kind of integrated in your application. So once you install these, run a build, and then you can go down here, run this command, and this should scaffold in everything that you did in the database. As you can see, now that it ran, we have our players class, which has player ID, name, jersey number. And then we have our DB context, which is all here now. So we now can connect this to our repository and connect the repository to our controller. So now let's move ahead and go do that. But first, I do want to add in my program. I will need a few things, and I might as well just add it now before I forget. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to first want to add our DB context and add our SQL server. So we're going to add that right here. So we're going to have our sample database context. We want to just add that here using models. And while we're here and we're already using models, I just want to go ahead and do a global using so that we use models all over. And then for SQL Server, we're going to use Entity Framework Core everywhere as well. So these global usings are just good to have. I like them. They just get rid of all that clutter at the top of files. So we're going to need that. Our default connection string in the app setting is already set. So if you haven't done that, don't forget to set your app settings. And then we will have to come back here though to add our repository, but we'll come back here and add that in later. But the other thing we do have to add is we are gonna need cores. So when you have an Angular application and a backend application, you're gonna have this like cross origin thing where it's just like a protection that your browser has. So you do need to set this to only allow origins or URLs that you want to set. So this is the I guess this would be the proper way of doing it, so that you only let kind of the URLs or endpoints that you want to hit your API hit it. So our application is going to be running on localhost 4200. So I'm only allowing this origin. And I guess if you were in a more production environment, you would be like wherever your front end application was hosted, you would put that URL here. So your API, wherever it's hosted, would only allow, from a select amount of, origins. So that's kind of how you get around that. And then you do have to add it and add your policy down here. If not, you will get errors where your front end will not be able to speak to your back end. So that is one super key thing, and we'll be back here to add in our repository in a little bit. But now let's go ahead and add our controller and add all that other good stuff that we have been putting off. So let's create our controller here. This is, let's just go ahead and do his read write actions. So what we're going to need here is we don't really need this index. We don't need this at all. We can get rid of this. And we can do controller base here. And that's fine. And then we now need to bring in our repository, which we have not created. And we're going to have to create as of now. So let's go and do that right now. So first, let's go create our interface. This is going to be iPlayer interface or iPlayer repository. And following with the repository pattern. If you guys have not seen the repository pattern video that I did, go check it out. There's going to be a card right here. And in that interface, we're going to have our 4 methods that we're going to be implementing. So we're going to have a get players, edit player, create player, and delete player. Very simple, very straightforward, nothing too wild. And now let's go ahead and create our repository as well so that we have all our files here and we don't have any weird little errors with files missing. So here we're going to have our player repository. And this is going to implement iPlayer repository. So now the error that we have here is we obviously need to implement every single one of these interfaces. So let's quickly just throw in the not implemented exception. And we're going to need to bring in our database, our DB context. So let's bring that in. Let's scaffold this really fast. Now let's bring in our repository, do our little constructor. This needs to be this. Boom, now we have our database context injected into our repository. And now let's actually create our methods. So our create is going to be very easy, very straightforward, nothing too wild. And it's just going to be our database context talking to our players table. You were just going to add it in. And then once we have that in there, all we're going to need to do is just save changes async. And with async, that means we're going to need async right here so that we can actually do everything async. And with that, boom, we have it. So we're going to add in our new player. We are going to wait and save changes. And then we're just going to return the ID of what we just created. Next on the slate is delete player. This one will also need to be async right here. And let's quickly move in the code. Quickly just explain. We're going to need to replace this, this, and this. So what are we doing here? We have our player ID of what we're going to delete. We first have to go retrieve it. So where this player ID equals one entry in our players table, we then remove it, and then we save our changes and return true that it happened. And that's it. That's how you delete a player. Now let's move on to edit. Edit will also be async. And then let's now move all our code in here. Again, let me replace these DB context. And in edit, what do? You first go get, and then you actually edit the player. So you're going to need to, by player ID, go find it, retrieve it, first or default. Then we replace the name and jersey number, which are editable fields. And then we just save it and return the player ID of who we just edited. And now finally, the easiest one, we are getting all the players that we have in our database. Very easy, very straightforward. For this one, all we are doing is we are just getting the full list of the players table, and then we are just returning it, and boom, this is our repository done. We have this set up with our DB context injected, and now let's go finish the controller. So now we're back in the controller. We can now just throw in our interface right here. We could move this to the global using at the beginning, but I don't really want to do that right now. But that is an option. We need our constructor for our controller where we're injecting the repository. I'm actually just going to delete all these methods because they didn't actually generate exactly what I wanted to, and it's much faster because I already have my methods anyway. So what we're going to do here, we have our HTTP get. This is going to be our get players. This is again very easy. Get players, and we're just going to hit our repository to get to this method down here, which just gives our back our list. Nothing too crazy, very straightforward, easy to do, easy to code. Now our post is again going to be just a few lines. Task async is what we're returning. We're returning OK as well. We are just from the body grabbing the player and passing it along to our repository. Very easy. Something very similar is happening with put, except obviously it's going to the edit player method. And then in HTTP delete, all we're doing is we're getting an ID from the URL from the front end like we had seen before from the services, and then going to delete player. And that's all we have to do here. And now that we have all our methods done here in the controller, right before I move on, I do want to make sure that I add this in here because we are going to need our route and to say that this is an API controller for the front end. We do need to go to program, and we need to add in our scoped reference for our repositories so that we don't have any errors thrown from here. Let's add in these using statements, and we should be good to go when it comes to this. So now if I run this, we should be able to see that we have our API endpoints. Boom, get players is right here. If we wanted to try it out, we could, but we wouldn't get a pretty result because we're returning OK. We're not getting that. But as you can see, our post is here, our put, and our delete. So now let's put this all together and see it working in action. Awesome. Now that we have our front end, our back end, our database, entity framework, everything set up, let's now test our application. Let's see if our Angular 14 and Angular material is correctly talking to our API. So let's run our API. Our API is right here, ready to go. Our Angular is also already running on localhost 4200. Let's move our application right here. And as we can see, we have that one entry that we had in the database back here. Execute, still here. So we have our one entry here. Let's quickly add a player. Let's do Mbappe. Let's do jersey number 7, I believe. That's what he is on PSG. Let's create it. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. There needs to be like a little bit of async, kind of how you refresh the data source. But it is working. It's just a little bit of a UI thing, kind of a little bit out of scope for kind of the tutorial that I wanted to do. But that's just kind of something that you need to handle. But this is working. Now let's say we wanted to edit this, and we want actually we're messy fans, and we want to do messy. So let's actually, edit him. So Mbappe's gone, Messi's there now. I think I could have done a better way of putting like edit or something if it was an edit, but that's another one of those things. And now if we want to delete it, player was successfully deleted. Repeat, and we're done. So as you can see, we're pulling in, and we're doing everything that we need to do. So let's create this again. So we can show that we have 2. Boom, we have 2. So this is the full application, guys. This is a Angular version 14 front end, which I did at least go over forms, and then our .NET 6 API with a whole SQL database, a full-blown application, and then you can take this to wherever your wild imagination wants to take it. But this is where I'm going to end for today, guys. And if you guys enjoyed this video, please remember to drop a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you guys at the next video.